Good afternoon. Paula, are you on? Can anyone confirm audio? Very good, thank you for that confirmation in the chat box. Paula, are you on the call? Okay, I don't know if we have Midland on the call yet. How about our panelists? Any of our panelists on? Andy, Paula, or Danita? Or excuse me, Andy, Christy, or Danita? It appears from the chat that the panelists can hear the audio, but I am still unable to hear anyone else on the call. This is Sean Van Holzen, by the way, the moderator. Can any of the panelists try to say something? Okay, still looking for audio confirmation from the panelists. I've not yet heard from Danita, Andy, or Christy. Perhaps they haven't joined yet. Hi, Diane, are you able to hear me?
Hey, Sean, this is Diane with Midland. Can you hear me?
I can now, yes. I was starting to feel quite alone there, Diane. This is the first voice I've heard. Do you know if any of our panelists are on yet, Diane?
I'm just checking. It doesn't look like it.
Okay.
I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen just to confirm that that's all working.
Perfect.
Do you now see your first introduction slide there?
Not yet, but let's check here.
Here, let me try this one. How about that?
Perfect. There you go.
Okay, and I'll see if I can advance through it here. That one worked? Okay, very good. I think we're all set then with the video, and audio seems to be working. Once we have our panelists here, we should be good to go.
Great. Sounds good. Thank you.
Diane, did you or anyone from Midland plan to open at the beginning?
Yep, I'll go ahead and start it off here a little after 1 and then pass it off.
Very good. Perfect.
Great. So good afternoon to everyone that's on. I see some folks are still joining us. We'll get started just after 1 o'clock here. So just a few more minutes.
Hello, hello.
Is that Andy?
Yes,
Yep.
it is.
Hi, Andy. We can hear you now.
Good. Hi, everybody.
So we'll get started here in just a few minutes.
Yep, always wise to leave a couple of minutes for technical difficulties, hence trying to log in a few
Exactly.
minutes ago with the wrong link.
No problem. Good afternoon to everyone who's just joining here. We're going to give it a few minutes to give some folks time to get logged on, and we'll get started shortly after 1 o'clock Central. Thank you. Hi, Christy. How are you doing? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. I'm like, how do
Okay.
I know I'm here?
You're here.
Gracious.
Nope, you're good. We'll get started
good.
here in just a few minutes.
Okay, sounds good. Sorry about that. I was in the wrong one.
Nope, you're good.
Hey there, Christy. It's Andy. I did the same thing.
Oh, good. Thank God. I thought it was just me.
No.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's just 1 o'clock here, but we'll give it just one more minute to let folks get logged on, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. This is Diane Lechner. I'm the National Sales Manager with Midland Scientific. So just wanted to give a short introduction here. We do have one panelist that we're working through some technical difficulties to get logged on, but we can go ahead and get started in the interest of everyone's time. So again, thank you for joining. We've got our opening slide here for the virtual FELC 2020. Very unfortunate that we all couldn't see you guys in person, but excited to talk on some of these hot topics in the industries that we think are important for all of you guys. So I wanted to specifically thank all of the sponsors that we have listed here to kind of help put this on. And then Sean Van Holsen from Poet is going to go ahead and moderate this for us today through all of our panelists talking to the USP grade alcohol production. So Sean, I'll go ahead and hand it off to you, and thank you again, everyone, for joining us today.
Very good, thanks, Diane. And we'll jump right into it here for the sake of time. We have a lot of great topics and experts speaking on those topics here. A lot of material to get through. So without further ado, I'll get out of the way here. I'm going to go ahead and introduce then our first speaker, and she probably needs no introduction to this group. All of you know Christy Moore very well. I'm sure she is well known in our industry as an expert on many technical topics, but nonetheless, she gets the same introduction as everyone else here. So Christy's going to talk on beverage and industrial grades of alcohol. She's going to give us a little introduction or primer. Christy Moore is a leading authority on motor fuel quality, regulatory safety, and environmental aspects. Christy is a consultant for Growth Energy on both domestic and international market development. She has extensive knowledge of the fuel, beverage, and industrial alcohol industries, using this experience to address technical regulatory issues for building domestic and global markets. She's an active participant in global standard-setting organizations such as ASTM International, the Canadian General Standards Board, ISO, and many others. So, Christy, thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Fantastic, Sean. I find this topic just so funny to me. Like it's, I've got a great sense of humor, but now I realize that nobody gets my jokes, right? Like I tell this as an opener every time I speak. People want to know if we can drink the alcohol that's made at a fuel plant. And my joke answer is no, we make better alcohol for drinking, but here we go. So alcohol for ethanol for food, pharma, and personal care. I am really just the opening act because you've got fantastic subject matter experts coming up after me. So I'm just going to give you a lay of the land and tell you a little bit about myself, but more importantly, talk to you about ethanol for these food and pharma and personal care applications. Sean, are you moving the slides or am I?
I will do that for the speakers, Christy. So there you go. You could just say next slide for the speakers. You just say next slide. I'll advance it for you.
You got it. Thank you. Thank you so much. Always taking care of me. So what I find amazing is that even though I would say 95% of the industry knows me from my fuel work and, the work I'm doing on E15 at the state level at ASTM, ISO, and internationally, what I don't think that people understood is that I was ADM's backup on fuel. I was not the primary expert. That was Chuck Core. And in 1994, I actually started at the largest distillery in the world. And I made about 70 different grades of alcohol, hydrous, anhydrous, with denaturant, with no denaturant, cut to a certain proof, not to a certain proof. We made it for API, which in this world is an active pharmaceutical ingredient. We made it for personal care products, hairspray, lotions, and soaps. We made excellent grain neutral spirits for the vodka markets. And really, I think this industry only knew me from 2007 on, when I really came out of ADM and worked for a trade association, and I work for Growth Energy, which I'm eternally grateful for. So here's me standing in Mexico City as we're trying to open up the market to fuel with my technical and government relations team. So next slide, Sean. So why is ethanol so ubiquitous, right? Why can it be such a great fuel? But then we've got this other market and these other applications where ethanol has been used really 60, 70, 80 years, and the market is smaller, and it's not well known. Well, here is, you know, all of the beneficial characteristics of ethanol. Water white solvent, flammable and consumable. It's very water soluble. It has a broad range of solubilities. It evaporates. It's natural. It has no odor. It has no color. It can be used as a carrier because it's got these great solubility properties. And then, of course, it's agriculturally derived, right? It's a natural product. It's not made from fossil fuels. And from the Equistar ethanol handbook, you can see these typical industrial alcohol applications, and they range from food applications, as in vinegar, to hair, scalp preparations, which is lotions and soaps, because ethanol is such a great solvent. It can get the adhesive into a liquid form and to a degree of tacky or stickiness that can then be used in the application and to further the product. So it's really this fabulous product that can be used in, you know, a wide range of applications. Next slide. So when we talk about, you know, this part of the ethanol business is dramatically different than fuel. In fuel, we have one product code, we have one specification, and really, even globally, we're pushing one product and one specification. When I was at ADM, I had a contributing role to ADM's food ingredient catalog, and this was just a small sampling of the products that we offered at ADM. We offered it at 192, 190, 200. We had grain neutral spirits, which is different from an industrial or a product that doesn't have an acronym after it, like USP. You've got specially denatured alcohols, which is what SDA stands for. You know, you've got this whole variety of alcohols because of the application, and the customer tells you what product they want. And are they very similar products? Yes, but they have, you know, pointed differences that make all the difference to the customer. Next slide. So when you're talking about selling into the pharmaceutical industry, it's going to be the hand sanitizer, right? The active pharmaceutical ingredient, where ethanol is actually going to kill the bacteria on the skin. It is the product that's doing the work. And the reason why it needs to be a pharmacopoeia grade is because your skin is porous. Your skin absorbs things. So as a doctor walks into a patient's hospital room, the first thing they do in the room is hit the button on the wall where the hand sanitizer is. They rub their hands together. Some of that hand sanitizer permeates the skin. The doctor treats the patient. What's he do on the way out, or her do on the way out? They hit the button again. They put more hand sanitizer on their hands. So as you think about what is the grade and what is the quality and the oversight that's needed by these various applications, you really got to think about how it affects, you know, humans, the environment, drinking water, you know, soil, every, you know, the whole spectrum of applications, but how it affects those, gosh, I'm tongue-tied today, how it affects the environment and how it's going to be used. So ethanol can be used in pharmaceutical applications, food applications, cosmetics, toiletries, detergents. It is a readily available surfactant or dilutant for surfactants in a lot of household detergents. You've got industrial solvents, then you've got chemical intermediates, and then really lastly, you've got fuel. And not lastly in the fact that it takes less quality, it takes different priorities and different attention to detail for fuel. So when we're talking about fuel, we're talking about 17 billion gallons of ethanol used, you know, across the United States in 240 million vehicles. At the top, you're talking about 40 to 50 million gallons in hand sanitizer, but the dosage is less than a teaspoonful for every time it's used. So you've got to think about the application and the volume as well when we're talking about the regulatory oversight. Next slide. So who are the customers? So when in my previous life, and that's what I refer to, my non-fuel life, I was one of the first suppliers to Gojo. Gojo invented hand sanitizer. They were amazing people to work with. You've got Vijon in the Germex brand. You've got Colgate-Palmolive. You've got Clorox. You've got all the surface cleaner folks, as in Reckitt Benckiser, Clorox, S.C. Johnson, some other products by Procter & Gamble. You've got, then you've got such attention to detail these days on hand sanitizer. I put all the largest hand sanitizer customers in here: 3M, Ecolab, Kimberly-Clark, the Sanofi folks, and the Cintas folks. So these are a whole new area of customers that maybe you've never had any interaction with. Next slide. So when it comes to these new customers and these new applications, what is the mindset that you need as a producer of this product as you're making your ethanol for this specific application? So if it's USP, where do I go? What's important in this area? And Andy and Danita are both going to talk to you about what is important when we talk about USP. Let's talk about food. Ethanol is a great solvent for all the inks and the flavors. It's widely used in perfumes and colognes. It's also used in a lot of food applications, and as in vinegar and pickling. You've also got some, Sean, I think we flipped back. And then you've got down at the bottom, industrial and fuel. The very largest volume markets are industrial and fuel. Ethanol is a great chemical intermediate as a solvent, and it may be bought by the barge quantity. So think about a whole barge quantity of industrial alcohol going to a chemical processor in the Houston Ship Channel or in New Orleans, Louisiana, and you're going to sell your product into that chemical intermediate, but that facility is massive, and you could be affecting millions and millions of dollars of chemical intermediate chemical synthesis as your product is just being consumed maybe as a solvent or playing some other role in that chemical synthesis. But what's important is ethanol really does have a standard slate of characteristics. You'll see that whether we're talking about USP or food or fuel, we look at ethanol content, we look at water content, we look at non-volatile matter, we look at acidity. So even though we've got the same, parameters that we're measuring, their limits and their importance change dramatically per application. Next slide. So what is the ethanol plant? What do we need to be thinking about as we're the manufacturers of this product? If you're making a pharmaceutical, you've got to run your plant as a pharmaceutical production facility. We need to know whether the customer wants denatured or undenatured. You can still buy a USP product that is denatured. It can never have touched a hydrocarbon, but it can still carry a denaturant. In most cases, that denaturant is strictly a tax status for the customer. Then you've got to, pay attention to the water content. We've got water specifications in all this range that go from severely, dehydrated products, 300 parts per million water. And then you've got other in maybe the surface cleaner area that allows up to 5% water by volume. This is really primarily a cost consideration for your customer. It's not your choice, it's the customer's choice. The impurity levels, vary dramatically. You must meet the rigorous low impurity levels that are required by USP, but in my mind, that is not the most strict application for quality of product. It's the grain neutral spirits industry. Back in the 90s, the vodka industry went through a significant overhaul and really went to an ultra pure product that really, hands down, is more difficult to meet than the USP specification. Then, of course, you've got color and odor. Just a note on the safety side, all of these blends of ethanol are flammable and thus carry, the requirements of the Department of Transportation hazardous materials. Next slide. So when the pandemic started in March, my phone started ringing off the hook, and everyone in the ethanol industry is looking to switch over and make a USP alcohol. And I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. You cannot just test your way into product quality here. You can't just take a sample off today's production, test it against the USP monograph and say, oh, looky there, it meets all the parameters, therefore my product is USP. The next two panelists are going to explain to you why that is not the case. You have to operate the plant under USP, GMP conditions, then you test the product. And then once you've got those two components working in tandem together, then you can claim your product as USP. But it is critical that you operate your facility and test your product, and then together you can declare what the quality is. Next slide. So we say, is all ethanol alike, or is it? Yes, ethanol, the molecule is the same. And in our industry, I think we've talked a lot about sugarcane-based ethanol versus sorghum-based versus corn-based, and mostly from a carbon intensity scoring aspect. In this world, in the USP food grade world, we actually talk about a synthetic ethanol, where it's made from fossil fuels and it's the hydrogenation of ethylene, which is a byproduct of crude oil refining. We actually talk about certifications such as kosher. When you go to the pickle aisle, I think that's probably the most common recognition of a kosher pickle. We talk about organic alcohols. We talk about non-genetically modified. We talk about agriculturally derived versus synthetic. These are a whole new ballgame outside of the fuel industry. So not all ethanol is alike in this, in this industry of USP and pharma. Next slide. So as we talked earlier, ethanol has really a very common slate of parameters that we check for. And whether you're looking at USP or food or fuel, you can see here that, we're looking at kind of the same impurities. However, a significant difference is the analytical methods that are used to measure each one of these properties. USP does not normally reference an ASTM method. They have their own methods. Whether you're talking about the Food Chemical Codex or National Formulary, they have their own set of laboratory methods. Only the fuel industry recognizes ASTM methods. And that is a significant shift and new learning, new area of education that our plants have got to understand and then comply. You've got to approve equivalence if you're not going to use the test method that's listed in the spec. Next slide. So my final thoughts is your primer is, hey, can USP grade alcohol be made at the 208 ethanol plants that are in the United States? My comment is, with due diligence, absolutely. But not all ethanol is the same. And here is my number one example, and I've been given this example for about 6 months. If my ethanol plant was located in Flint, Michigan, and I used city water to feed my plant, my ethanol would be contaminated with lead because the Flint, Michigan municipal water supply has lead contamination. So when you're making this product, this product is 95% ethanol and 5% water. That 5% water is part of your water supply that feeds your plant. You have to have, as a robust system, monitoring your ethanol and monitoring your process as you do the incoming water, because 5% of that water ends up in the process. So here's where it culminates. Know your process and know your product. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Sean.
Thank you, Christy. Appreciate you setting the stage here today for these discussions. We're going to keep moving along for the sake of time. Our next panelist is from USP. Danita, and I realize now, Danita, I should have asked how to pronounce your name. I'm sorry if I misspeak here, but Danita Broyles?
That's perfect.
Okay, thank you. Danita Broyles is the Senior Market Development Manager at USP with a focus in the excipient monograph donation acquisition activities. She also manages the market development areas for the ingredient verification program, both for active pharmaceutical ingredients and excipients. Danita possesses a passion for compendial compliance to ensure global patients receive medicines with quality ingredients. Danita comes to USP with over 17 years experience working in pharmaceutical industry in a variety of roles from method development, R&D, raw material development release, compendial affairs, and regulatory affairs in both consumer healthcare and prescription product roles. Danita has had leadership roles in pharmaceutical industry groups, including the Midwest Compendial Discussion Group, New Jersey Pharmaceutical Quality Control Association, the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations. Danita also co-chaired the USP Compendial Process Improvement Team and was a member of the USP General Notices Project Team prior to accepting her role at USP. Danita has a bachelor's in chemistry and an MS degree in biomedical engineering. Danita, take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the intro. And once again, you get those points for pronouncing my name perfectly. Okay, so I totally believe that together everyone on this phone can ensure the quality of medicines. Good afternoon. My name is Danita Broyles, Senior Market Development Manager at USP. Next slide, please. All right, just some high-level information about USP. First of all, we're a standard-setting organization. So we set public standards of quality for drugs and ingredients that go into drugs, and we've been doing this since 1820. So if you do your math, we're actually so proud that we're a 200-year-old organization. We're not part of the government. We're actually our own separate nonprofit, which actually benefits USP, and it really benefits the customer. And that unlike most pharmacopoeias, we're not part of the government. Our standards to date have impacted over 2 billion people, and everything we do is volunteer-based, and we're proud that, we've created 6,000 monographs. We have over 3,500 reference standards. Next slide, please.
Danita, real quick, this is Sean. We are able to hear you, but you are breaking up a little bit, so I don't know if perhaps you're using a headset or something. Again, we are able to hear you, but it is a little bit disruptive with the background, just so you know.
Thank you. I believe it is something with it's probably my work laptop. Give me 1 minute to adjust sound.
Okay, it actually seems much better right now, but.
Perfect. That just means I need to be closer to my laptop.
There you go. Let's try that. Take it away.
Great. All right. So high level USP mission. This is what drives everyone at USP. And it's really impacting global health to ensure the quality, safety, and benefits to medicine and foods. So for medicines, you saw in the previous presentation that we talked about USP-NF. That applies to your pharmaceutical ingredients and drugs and foods, which USP actually owns the Food Chemicals Codex, or the FCC. Next slide.
And that breakup is back a little bit, Danita. So if you're able to change something easily, otherwise I think it will work the way it is. Just a little bit of breakup in the audio.
Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. So when we talk about drug products, the reason USP is very important, and if you can just keep clicking the down key for the animations, but combined with USP is not optional. Actually, it's codified in the law within the U.S. per the FD&C Act of 1938. That law was enacted because there were over 100 people who died taking a drug for an alternate use than what it was intended for, and it actually made people sick. And so the USP got codified in the FELC Act of 1938 It applies to biologics and regular drugs, and it said that if you're going to market a drug within the United States, that you must meet the USP standard if one exists or be deemed adulterated. Next slide, please. Okay, so typically when people hear the USP-NF, if you come from a pharma background like I do, we used to call it the book. Throughout the year, it was like a 5-volume edition, and you'd really get your muscles up from lifting that 5 volumes. USP recently has moved totally online only, and our quality standards exist primarily of 3 things: your monographs, which are a listing of your tests and specifications for both drugs and ingredients in drugs; your general chapters, which include broadly applicable information on either processes, tests, or methods, and they support the monographs, things like pH, water testing, things of that nature. And then we have what we call reference standards that are used to quantify, perform a quality test somewhere within the monograph. Next slide, please. Okay, so and the previous speaker, I loved how she talked about USP-NF and our monographs and our specifications and who can donate. Basically, if you have chemical knowledge of that particular material or that drug, we would actually love to work with you. Anywhere from ingredient distributors, manufacturers, drug product manufacturers, contract testing organizations, academia, even the FDA sometimes works with we work together on certain things to improve the quality of the methods in the monograph. So if you look at a monograph and the test looks a little antiquated, if you have something more modern, we would love for you to contact us and work with us to help ensure the quality of medicines through those written monographs. Next slide, please. And this slide just is saying that even if you have limited information, we have laboratories in Rockville, Maryland, even in India, where sometimes if you even have limited information, we can take things in our labs and verify or validate certain methods just to try to improve the quality of the public health. Next slide. And I'm not going to spend any time on this. This is just, if anyone's interested, it'll be in what you get emailed, our monograph development process, which shows you from the time someone gives us some information until the time it's official, the various steps that have to happen to create this public standard. It's not like somebody gives us their methods and, you know, within a month it's a public standard. It's a quite lengthy process, and throughout the process, there is various opportunities for companies to interact or to suggest improvements to the public standard. Next. Okay, and oh, you can go to the next slide. So as probably the last speaker and everyone on the phone is aware of, starting in June of this year, the FDA has realized that there is methanol adulteration in ethanol-based hand sanitizers, and that kind of led to, of course, the list that FDA has come out with, and that precipitated USP working with FDA to revise our alcohol and dehydrated alcohol monographs. And mind you, 2 weeks ago, the FDA do not include list for hand sanitizers was up to 183, and I think I looked a week ago and it was like 196. Next slide. So it just shows that from a public health perspective, that, you know, USP has a role to play in ensuring the public health, because hand sanitizers are considered they're considered a drug product, and of course ethanol is one of the active ingredients. Additionally, ethanol can be used as an excipient in a lot of cough and cold medicines. So imagine what would happen if there was some methanol adulterated in ethanol. That could create death, blindness, or a whole bevy of problems. So this slide in particular was taken from that FDA temporary policy, and I've listed the link. And so it gives you some information from FDA about how you can derive alcohol from synthetic processes in hand sanitizers, but it has to meet the USP or the FCC monograph. At USP, we developed the test and the specifications based on what's approved by FDA a lot of times in those drug products. FDA, they're the enforcement agency of what we include in our public standards. And then for alcohol produced in facilities that normally produce fuel or technical grade alcohol, I listed some information there as well. Next slide. And so as we went through the list, it was like 183 at that time. Some of the FDA's findings was there were numbers of hand sanitizers that were tested that were found to contain methanol, or instead of isopropanol, they found 1-propanol, or they were labeled to have contained methanol. Lots of those hand sanitizers were recalled by the manufacturer or the distributor, and some of the ingredients like ethanol, isopropanol, or benzalkonium chloride were found to be subpotent, which means the amount of ethyl alcohol or the other ingredients were less than what they were supposed to be on the label. Next slide, please. And this is just our graphic representation of the countries for those hand sanitizers on the FDA's Do Not Include list. Next slide. So this slide just speaks to a letter that FDA wrote USP to support the modernization of monographs. And the key point here, anything that was vulnerable to what we call economically motivated adulteration, EMAs, FDA asked USP as far as 10 years back to work to improve the quality of those monographs to protect the public. Because if you haven't heard about like adulteration of glycerin or propylene glycol, people have died from economically motivated adulteration in ingredients in drugs. Next slide. So we're not going to blow it up, but that's just a representation of the recently updated USP monograph for alcohol, where we had an impurities test that calculated methanol. While that's still listed as an impurity method, we moved it, the limit for methanol also into the identification section of the USP monograph to help protect the public good. Next slide. And that's just how the rest of the monograph looks. And as I had stated before, the monograph is a list of test specifications and sometimes general test methods that allows a user to test the quality of that ingredient. Next slide. So why does this matter? If you go to the next slide, and it's codified in the US law. So for drug manufacturers, some of them will pull the results off of the supplier certificate of analysis and not do full testing, but they have to make sure that they follow the 21 CFR 211 requirements that say you have to conduct at least one test to verify the identity. Additionally, you have to perform full testing of that ingredient annually. And it tells you you can pull off of the C of A. However, you have to perform at least one specific identity test. And if it's a USP monograph that lists 3 different methods, you got to do all of those USP identity tests in order for a drug manufacturer. So a customer of an ethanol producer would have, if they wanted to pull off C of A, they have to verify the quality of that ingredient. And then at a bare minimum, they have to do identification testing on batches that come in. And then at a regular interval, they have to verify with full testing annually. And when I was in pharma, we normally do full testing on that ingredient, maybe 1 lot per year, but the regulation doesn't speak to what's an annual or regular interval or how many batches, but that was just an industry standard. Next slide. So we want you all to know, ingredient manufacturers, drug manufacturers, you're not alone in this. You know, yes, the law does say that you are responsible, but USP is here to work with you. We have services to help, things like the USP Ingredient Verification Program, our educational courses, the Monograph's general chapters are here to help you, and we also have reference standards. And then we have stakeholder forums where they're free to attend, let your voice be heard. I'm more than happy to even send the link afterwards to the USP website where you can even sign up for some of these forums or opportunities to let your voice be heard. Next slide. So one of the programs that I specialize in that I really think would be beneficial for this audience is our ingredient verification program. Next slide. So what is it? If you're like my family, they have no clue like what I do at USP till they see like the Nature Made commercials that says this product has been verified by USP. What does that mean? Our verification program, it's comprehensive where we evaluate the quality of ingredients and we have a testing program, strictly voluntary. Verify the quality, purity, and potency of ingredients. And then it's a continuous process year after year. And with the onslaught of new companies that are producing ethanol, how would you differentiate the quality of your material from probably the bevy of other companies that are out there selling ethanol for hand sanitizer? One way to help differentiate your company is participating in the USP Ingredient Verification Program. And if you're a drug manufacturer, how do you know that a particular manufacturer is not doing economically motivated adulteration? One way is to use producers who are USP verified. Next slide. And I'm going to go through this probably really quickly, but I'm more than happy to take, I'll set up meetings afterwards or even take emails all day. I love emails. So it's a 3-step process where we start with your typical 3-day GMP facilities audit. We come in, and right now because of COVID, we have a virtual audit that we will do. And that lets us know, for the 3 days we're there, what's the status of a company's quality, as well as do they have a quality management system? But the one thing that a 3-day audit only doesn't tell you is how well does the company implement quality in their quality management system. That's what we do. We call the quality control manufacturing product documentation review, where we're going through taking a deep dive, looking at your quality records, your batch records, your deviations, OOSs, to see how a company implements quality over the long term. And that will let us know, were there quality issues with the company that didn't get uncovered within that 3-day audit? Last but not least, we do product testing. Remember the FDA law from CFR 21-11 said that in order for manufacturers to pull off the certificate of analysis, they had to do a minimum number of batches at regular intervals. USP, we don't even do the typical industry average of 1 lot per year. We do 3 annually. Next slide. And this is just a graphic representation that breaks down those 3 big triangle steps into smaller steps for you to see for like the GMP audit, what happens? The QCM, what we call the quality control manufacturing, what happens there? Next slide. Okay, so what happens if a company passes all 3 segments of our verification program? It's a great day for that company because what they get is a notification letter from USP that indicate that we have successfully verified their ingredient and the manufacturing site where that ingredient was made. We also give our customers a certificate of standards compliance. We give the company a copy of their audit report that then what they can do with the audit report is to give it to their customers, those drug companies. And that may reduce the number of audits from by the drug companies of the ethanol producers. So if your company has like 100 audits, GMP audits from your customers, you may be able to give the USP GMP audit to that company, and it could potentially significantly reduce the number of audits that your company gets from its customers. Additionally, we can give your company the results from their certificates of analysis then that you give to the customers to show that USP has done that full testing on an annual basis to verify what's on your company's certificate of analysis is true and valid. And last but certainly not least, you can display that orange USP verified mark on your ingredients, bulk labels, and certificates of analysis to further let your customers know that the quality of your ingredients definitely is high quality because you passed the USP verification program. And then USP, we list anyone who has been USP verified on our website as well as the ingredients and locations. Next slide. And I'm not going to go through this. The only purpose of this slide is to show you that we do this USP verification is not a one and done where you pass it 1 year and you can use our logo forever. USP comes in on an annual basis and we do the GMP facility audit, the product documentation review, and the product testing. And so when we speak to the GMPs, USP, if it is an active pharmaceutical ingredient, we use the ICH guidelines that we audit against. And if you manufacture ethanol for use as an excipient, we would audit against the ANSI 363 GMPs, just to let you know how we audit. Next slide. And if you're looking, if you need more information on verification, this is our website where you can look up all of this. We have a manual, the 60 pages that gives a deep dive into the program. We also have educational courses. Next slide. And I'm not going through this, but this just lists the many, many benefits to companies like yours that are ingredient manufacturers from participating in these programs, including you're being audited by ICHQ7 or the ANSI 363, depending on if you're an API or excipient manufacturer. And it gives your customers assurance that the verification came from USP. We're trusted, we're independent, not part of the FDA, and we're a science-based standard setting body. Next slide. And this is a long list of benefits that then you can explain with your customers why you're USP verified and the benefits that your company being USP verified can bring to even your customers. So there's multiple layers of benefit from participating in this program. Next slide. So what can you do to ensure the quality of medicines in the future? Next slide. Become USP verified. Differentiate your company and the quality of your ingredients from some of the companies that are out there that may be there for economic reasons and not for the public health. Collaborate directly with USP via Monograph initiatives or participate in our educational courses, stakeholder forums, or other services that USP can provide. Next slide. And so with that, I'm going to thank you. Thanks the panel for inviting me to come speak about USP, something I'm extremely passionate about, which is helping global patients. This is my phone number as well as my email. I look forward to having potential conversations with anyone concerning the alcohol monographs or the USP verification program. Thank you.
Thank you, Danita, for that very thorough and informative overview of the USP organization. Very, very helpful. We're going to keep moving right along here, and I do anticipate that we'll go a little bit over our 3 o'clock end time, just to give Andy sufficient time to cover his topic thoroughly and allow some time for questions. I'm assuming that's okay with the Midland group there, that we go over, and hopefully folks are able to stay just a little bit longer. We tried to pack a lot into an hour here, as you can tell, but very, very good information. So our next speaker is going to talk about good manufacturing practices for ethanol plants, and that is Andy Powers of Newton Enterprises. He is a senior consultant there. It's a small private company offering clean room systems, engineering, equipment and installation, industrial membrane filtration products, and expert consulting services to ag, food, feed, pharma, and biotech sectors of industry. Andy is a veteran technical and commercial manager with almost 3 decades worth of experience, ranging from applied scientific research and development to quality and food safety management to commercial leadership and international business development. He holds a bachelor's degree in microbiology and a master's degree in business administration, both earned at the University of Illinois, including graduate studies abroad in Mexico and in Eastern Europe. And he holds several professional certifications, including Certified Lead Auditor for the ISO 9001 standard and for HACCP, and Certified Practitioner and Lead Auditor for the Safe Quality Food Initiative. He has also served on the Standards Committee and the Technical Committee for the American Dairy Products Institute, and is a member of the American Chemical Society, the American Society for Quality, and Beta Gamma Sigma. So with that, Andy, take it away.
Yeah, hi, Sean. If I hadn't written my own bio, I'm obviously an accomplished and shameless self-promoter. For the folks who are participating here, I am going to try to hustle through the material because we are a little bit pressed on time. But Sean, thanks for setting the stage and indicating that we are probably going to run over. Let's just go straight ahead to slide number 4, which begins with the core questions any of the ethanol producers who are participating have to ask themselves as they're trying to identify their GMP compliance obligations. It really starts with the products that you'll be manufacturing. Almost everybody, I'm sure, agrees that they're making animal foods. They may also be engaged in the production of human food. We'll get into some definitions in a little bit. Danita touched on the regulations in the pharmaceutical industry. And so you find yourself asking the question, am I making a pharmaceutical or drug product? And we'll look at the US regulations for that that are highly aligned with ICH-Q7. And the reality may be for some of the participants here that you're making all of the above. So it makes for a very complex regulatory landscape, and we will touch on the GMPs before we transition into the topics of documentation and record keeping and then auditing just a little bit. Next slide, please, Sean. Here's one of the definitions that I promised you. So the regulations kindly have stated for us what food means. And prior to the Food Safety Modernization Act, the implementation of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act gave us this definition. So we're talking about articles for food or drink from man or other animals. And that implication previously was that the original 110 good manufacturing practices applied, technically speaking, to both human food and to animal feed. Next slide, please. The Food Safety Modernization Act was signed into law in 2011. I'm sure that everybody participating is intimately familiar with those requirements. That was really the first facelift that was given to the US regulations in over 70 years. And they accomplished some very specific things for us that were long overdue. One of the benefits, thinking back to that definition of food, is that we got some focused good manufacturing practices for animal food, which I've called feed here, as well as a few of these other features, additional requirements that were established, and some transition in terms of terminology for risk assessment from the highly familiar HACCP approach to the slightly evolved HARP-C approach. Sean, next slide, please. To dive right into the 507 GMPs, food for animals, anybody, whether you're operating a wet milling operation or a dry mill, you're producing some or many of these products. And these ethanol co-products are all subject to those animal food GMPs that are codified in 21 CFR Part 507. Sean, next slide, please. Here are the major subsections for those, and we won't dive into them too deeply, but if you were previously familiar with the human food GMPs, 507 follows that lead and is very much aligned with those, with one or two sections, well, one section I think omitted, but really covering in a very parallel fashion the same topics from a regulatory point of view that were already addressed in the familiar 110 GMPs. Next slide, please. 110 got a facelift and became Part 117, the GMPs for human food. And one development is that FDA gained regulatory authority in addition to the existing authority of the TTB over alcohol that is used for food purposes. And now beverage alcohol is exempt from some of the requirements. There are 2 specific subparts and some of the other details, but as Danita touched on, there's increased emphasis in this concern about intentional or economically motivated adulteration, and that will be a continually evolving landscape over time. But the point being here that you now have GMP regulations that specifically apply to ethanol for food use. I know many of us may also be making carbon dioxide as a co-product or byproduct and selling that whether into industrial applications or into food applications, but you should understand and already be aware that Part 117 does apply to CO2 when it's being used for those food applications. Next slide, please. Here's what Part 117 looks like today, and you can see the titles of the subparts are very much aligned with what we already covered quickly in terms of Part 507. And you can see there in subpart F, record keeping requirements. We'll touch on that in a little bit more detail later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. Just to reiterate, the human food regulations will apply if you're engaged in the manufacture of ethanol for food use, such as grain neutral spirits, products that would comply and be labeled as compliant with the Food Chemicals Codex monographs, or again, if you're making CO2 for food or beverage use applications. Next slide, please. Here's another definition for us. If we're trying to understand whether or not the drug regulations apply, and this is a hot topic in the ethanol industry in this day and age, here's the definition of a drug from the United States point of view. It's articles recognized in the USP. So thank you, Danita, for setting the stage for our understanding of what the USP means and how it relates to ethanol produced for drug use. In terms of the US regs, that definition also applies to articles that will become components of drug products. And that usually for us means what we would call an excipient. I have not talked about the excipient landscape extensively in this presentation. There's a lot of material there, but we will refer to it superficially a couple of times throughout the presentation. At any rate, this is where the definition comes from. It gives traction for the applicability of the drug GMPs to the ethanol industry. Next slide, please. Referring to the ICH, or the International Council on Harmonization, this is a global consortium which endeavors to align all of the drug manufacturing regulations of the various countries involved in those industries. So ICH is an important influence, and the ICH Q7 guidelines include a glossary which has this definition for us. It tells us what they mean by the term active pharmaceutical ingredient, or APIs it's usually known, or drug substance, or sometimes bulk drug substance. It's largely the same definition as you see in the US regulations, and just another reference that helps us understand what regulations apply as we consider which products we're making. Next slide, please. A hot topic in this day and age, certainly born of the COVID epidemic, would be our understanding of how the ethanol industry serves the manufacture of important products like hand sanitizer. And before COVID, your facility may or may not have been aware that over-the-counter drug products like mouthwash, like hand sanitizer, like toothpaste, you can confirm that these are drug products if this was new to you just by checking out their labels. They have a drug facts label on each of those products, which alludes to its regulatory status. And these products, as well as prescription medications, are regulated as drugs in the United States and covered under 21 CFR in Chapter 1, Subchapter C. For those applications, USP grade alcohol is required. And as Christy stated in her presentation, this is not just a matter of complying with the specifications in the USP monograph, but it means a whole raft of obligations at the manufacturing level in order to produce a product of this nature. FDA has been giving the industry a pass, so to say, because of the national health emergency that is represented by COVID-19. So enforcement of FDA requirements around the manufacture of these products has been relatively lenient. But that enforcement is expected to expire on December 31st of this year, after which we should expect that the industry has invited a lot of additional scrutiny because of the entry of new players and because of that 180 plus list of do not include items on FDA's watch list representing adulterated ethanol or hand sanitizer related products out there in the marketplace. Next slide, please. So at the most superficial level, if you're looking at Chapter 1, Subchapter C, you really just see these four main parts that are immediately identifiable as applicable to this type of manufacturer. But as you dive a little bit deeper, you see this is just the tip of the iceberg. Sean, next slide, please. Here are the components of the GMPs in the drug universe, and they are extensive. Many of these may seem not to apply directly, especially if you're engaged in the manufacture of, say, USP grade alcohol in a bulk configuration. But it's evident here that from a regulatory point of view, there is significantly more substance that must be considered as you approach the topic of compliance in your facility. Next slide, please. So I alluded to this previously, and we talked about the list, the do not include list. The question becomes for the industry, how will FDA change their enforcement once they ease the leniency and make it past the December 31st deadline? I'd say it's fair that nobody in the group wants to be product number 184 on the do not include list. So it's important for us to understand our obligations and to make sure that we're compliant when that deadline rolls around. Next slide, please. So that was a quick pass through the GMPs, and I want to transition into the topic of documentation and record keeping. For the purposes of this webinar, I dove back into FDA's publication of 483s. Those forms are utilized to cite nonconformances in an official capacity when FDA inspectors come calling at your facility. And so I went through the animal food inspections and I went through the human food inspections. Thought it was interesting to see that of the 483s in the animal food space, 27% of those in some way, shape, or form had a deficiency related to documents and record keeping. Next slide, please. When you get to the human food side of the industry, and now you're talking about anybody making beverage ethanol, for example, that percentage jumps to a whopping 79%. And I think the takeaway from this, if you'll transition to the next slide, please, is that documentation is one of the key issues by which a facility's compliance is measured, and it's one of the most important issues for compliance assessment and enforcement by FDA, as evident in these 483s. Next slide, please. I would offer you three guiding principles when it comes to documentation and record keeping. And the first is very straightforward. If it isn't documented, it didn't happen. You might have a sparkling facility and products that readily conform to specifications, but if you're unable to present an inspector with the objective evidence in the form of records and documents, then it may be deemed a non-conformance and likely will result in a 483. So having both the performance and then the paperwork evidence of that supporting that performance, they're both essential components. Next slide, please. This one, do what you say and say what you do, hopefully is also a mantra in your facilities. The idea being that you have to make sure your documentation record keeping practices comply with the minimum expectation of the regulations, but make sure that what you write down is an accurate reflection of the actual practice in your facility, no more and no less. This is going to be the most valuable approach to assuring compliance, not just to make sure you cover the regs, but that you don't set yourself up with additional requirements that you in practice do not actually meet. And this links with the third point on the next slide, which is the keep it simple. I said sweetheart here. I grew up in a harsher environment than this, so it was a different noun. But my advice would be that simplicity should be your optimal paradigm when it comes to documentation and record keeping. And one way to affect simplicity in your documents is to intimately involve those who actually do the work in defining what your record keeping practices are. In that way, you not only stay aligned with the do what you say and say what you do principle, but you're also imparting a philosophy of simplicity in your record keeping. Next slide, please. Now to transition into auditing, the regulations again kindly give us a definition for that, though I think we all understand audits, both in terms of what it means to give them and how it feels to receive them. Here's the definition. We'll move on to the next slide, please. I thought it was interesting again to go back to the regulations and say category by category, animal food versus human food versus drug manufacturer. How often do you see the terminology related to audits? So I looked for the word inspect, the word examine, the word review, and the word audit. And I thought it was interesting to see that after food safety modernization, you see a high degree of harmony between the terminology in the animal food regs and the human food regs. When you get to 210 and 211 drug regulations, there is significantly more emphasis on inspecting and examining. And then you can see there's still a representation for review, but the word audit is mentioned not one time. And I think I would say the takeaway here is that the emphasis is on a second set of eyes at almost every step in a pharmaceutical process, and the emphasis is on prevention rather than after the fact evaluation. So I think that's what you can see. But anyway, I thought this was a good illustration of the harmony that exists across animal food and human food regs, and then the different approach that exists in the pharmaceutical industry. Next slide, please. I like this quote. This gentleman, Norman Ralph Augustine, was an aerospace, or is an aerospace engineer. He was an executive for Lockheed, I think, and he evidently had a certain viewpoint about auditors. The quote, I think, is hilarious. If you'll move on to the next slide, the reality for us is that in terms of receiving audits, everybody wants their pound of flesh, and that can make things especially challenging for us from a compliance point of view. Danita very wisely promoted USP services that may position your facility to utilize one audit in lieu of several others. It certainly wouldn't hurt to achieve a higher level of compliance, but it is a reality in this day and age that everyone wants their pound of flesh. Next slide, please. I think it's difficult sometimes because of the negative connotations associated with auditing to afford oneself a positive mindset about audits, but they should not be exercises and they should not necessarily be painful. They should be what I consider an investment. The opportunity to apply observational skills to bring about positive change, and in the absence of the consequences of a regulatory inspection, for example, where the same sort of observation might have more dire consequences. Next slide, please. So very generally speaking, I offered these tips for preparation for a successful audit. Some of this applies more when you're going to give the audit, some a bit more when you're going to receive the audit, but I think they're all relevant. We'll talk a little bit about audit attitude. We'll talk about the perspective that you employ for your observations, and then some clever tips for those observations that will help enhance the value of your audits themselves. Next slide, please. I think if you can begin an audit from the perspective that you're going to collaborate, whether giving the audit or receiving the audit, rather than confronting or clashing with the other audit participants, that's the most positive approach to deriving value from the audit experience. If anybody studied game theory, the prisoner's dilemma is a classical thought experiment that describes a situation where if the individual players act in their own selfish best interest, then the outcome is relatively poor. But if you can work together, and the key is to share information so that you can act together to your mutual benefit, then you have truly what results as a win-win for all the participants because of starting with a positive attitude. Another point that I wanted to impart was that when auditing or being audited, it's valuable to consider the individual point of interest from a 360-degree perspective, what I call turning the tables. So if you're performing an inspection of your facility, try to imagine what it's like to be in the shoes of the person on the other side of the issue and to understand any factors that are contributing either to a deficiency or to excellent performance that you might be able to capture and make systematic in your, as a result of an effective audit observation. Next slide, please. For myself, when I conduct audits, I try to think about making an observation from each of three different levels, and I call them the three scopes. So at the level of the minutiae, down in the weeds of an audit topic, I'd like to apply the microscope. It's just a metaphor for bringing whatever tools and tricks you can to that particular observation to study it at an appropriately minute level of detail. Next slide, please. The telescope is all about not losing track of the forest for the trees, stepping back and seeing how smaller issues where your focus might be with the microscope integrate with the bigger picture that you can only see when you take a step back. And I call that the telescope observational tool. Next slide, please. The third one is maybe a little bit touchy-feely, and I called it the horoscope. But the idea is not just in the moment or retrospectively, looking back at evidence of past compliance or current performance, try to be forward-thinking with each element of an observation that you're making. And in this way, you amplify the value of the audit process by turning your lens to the future view and trying to understand how what you're seeing today will relate to that future experience or level of compliance. Next slide, please. Looks like we're to the placeholders for all of my thank you and contact information at the end. Managed to stay reasonably on time with the 20 minutes that were allotted to me. I would urge everyone to reach out, whether by telephone or through any of the social media or email connections with your follow-up questions after the webinar. So thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Andy, for that very, very comprehensive overview of all the different areas, and kudos for staying on time. We went a little over just all together, and appreciate everybody sticking with us here. I believe we can take a moment here for some pressing questions if there are some. If you do have to fall off the call, we understand that, but I think we're able to maintain most of our audience here. And, you know, while we did go over just a few minutes here, I think we can all appreciate the fact that we just got a whole semester's worth of education in a little over an hour. So this was just absolutely fantastic group of speakers that we had lined up today. I believe, Diane, feel free to chime in here that they could either possibly verbally ask a question, although maybe you have to unmute them, or they could submit a question through the to the chat box if you'd like.
Yep, so they're not going to be able to speak. We had
Okay.
muted all attendees just for background noise, but if they do have a question, it can be put into the chat box, and we will be sending up a follow-up email with the presentation and contact information as well, that they could obviously reach out with specific questions too. So
Sounds great. You know, as we're waiting to see if someone has a burning question here, Andy, I had one that just came to mind. You stated in one of your slides with some definitiveness that you expect the FDA to remove their temporary guidance here at the end of the year. Is that coming from something that the FDA has formally issued, or is that kind of your professional assessment of what you see them doing here by the end of the year? That's something that is certainly important and we're in tune to as an industry, and just curious your further thoughts on that.
Oh, Sean, great question. I don't think I dreamed that. I do believe that I saw that in print in something from FDA officially, but I can reinforce that assertion with the actual reference to anybody who's interested, including you.
Okay, yeah, appreciate that, and you know, I think I would tend to agree, and perhaps it has been already definitively decided that they're going to do that at the end of the year. But given the challenges they've had with the slides that were shown there, with all the non-compliant product, it wouldn't surprise us to see them try to pull that away pretty quickly here.
Hey, Sean, I would add to that just a little editorial comment, which is to say that many of the adulterated products that were cited by FDA originated from outside the United States, or included materials that originated outside the United States. And I guess the point would be to pat our own industry on the back for such a high level of compliance, or maybe by inference, a low level of non-compliance, and the very low frequency of folks in the US space who are on that same list.
Yes,
yeah,
well
Sean,
said.
this
Go
is
ahead.
Christy, and I was just going to reiterate, I agree, Andy. You know, FDA, this is a moving target, right? And you can see, and I was going to ask Danita a question, if I could be so bold to be a panelist and a question. You can see that these entities, USP, FDA, TTB, are working very closely together, not only monitoring all the recalls, which, by the way, there's a similar number of recalls in Canada, that they're moving very quickly, especially in light of dangerous products, i.e. harmful in health, you know, with the application and use. And I was going to say to Danita, being a veteran of USP, and I've worked and I've been on several committees at USP, I found it amazingly quick that USP moved the standards of identity or changed the standards of identity because of all these recalls. And maybe she could comment or give us a little color on the fact that any other change, I would call it similar to ASTM, moving at glacial speed, but yet in the wake of hundreds of recalls, product recalls, USP moved quickly to protect, you know, health and human health. So I don't know if we can unmute Danita, but I'd love to hear a comment on that.
Danita, I think you can unmute yourself and answer that if you don't mind. Perfect.
Perfect. I'm unmuted now?
You are.
Wonderful. So I just want to say thank you for that comment, and it's spot on. When I gave the slide about how long does it take to create a monograph, that's about the same length of time it takes to issue revisions, because it has to go through a public commenting cycle. So it normally takes 1.5 years, 2 years for some of these monographs to go through revisions. But because of the urgency of the public health, and some of it was kids that drank the hand sanitizer and got sick, but some was people really got sick. We worked with FDA hand in hand and to get that standard quickly put out there, because for our US patient base, but USP is also listed for compliance in up to 140 other countries. So it could potentially be a global issue and a global health issue. And as it was said, most of those countries where the ethanol originated from was not within the US. So it goes to show that, you know, for public health, normally FDA and USP, we do move a little slow. But for the public health, everybody coordinated, got on the same page, and it was the same situation that happened in the early 2000s with glycerin and propylene glycol, where the adulteration actually killed people, and the standards were, you know, once we got a good method, the standards were quickly put out there to protect the public health.
Thank you for that. And then we did have a question come through on the chat here as well from Stephanie. So the question here is, what would it take to make our ethanol a surface sanitizer, and who would regulate that? And then could their 190 ethanol alone be a surface sanitizer, or would additional chemicals needed to be included?
This is Christy, and I'll take this one. So it depends. Sorry, I know these are such strange answers, but it totally depends. So when I was selling alcohol into hand sanitizer, whether it be for direct skin contact, you know, as a drug ingredient, or whether it was in for flavoring that went into a drug, right? Because ethanol is a great solvent for foods and dyes and flavors. And then of course you can evaporate off the ethanol once you have your coloring or your flavorant in solution. When you talk about surface sanitizers, you can also have USP grade surface sanitizers that are used for kitchens and food preparations. So it's important that you work with your customer. Your customer will tell you what type, grade, quality of product that they need, because they're the ones that are then issuing the guarantee. You're making, you know, you're providing an ingredient, but your customer is then going to tell you. So in some cases, you'll still be a USP, you know, grade food supply, or, you know, ingredient supplier. But by and large, for surface sanitation, EPA regulates this area. And so you may cross over into a couple of regulating agencies. And what would the additional chemicals need? That would, of course, depend on the customer as well. You've got some customers that are going to buy an SCA3A, which is 5% methanol. You've got some customers going to buy an SCA3C, which is 5% isopropanol. You've got some of them that are going to buy a 40B, which, you know, would be a common ingredient for surface sanitizers, Clorox, Lysol, you know, the Comet brand, et cetera, et cetera. So the answer is, unfortunately, it depends. And the reason is because the customer's formulation may require a certain denaturant, and for them to meet, you know, their patent requirement, or, you know, some other internal quality expectation for the way the product smells, looks, behaves, what colors, et cetera. So Sean, with that, have you got any more questions? Because I thought Danita's comment was spot on. And my other comment in this group is that I don't know of anybody in my current fuel circle that participates at USP. And what I would suggest to the participants here is that we utilize the willingness and the resources at USP with Danita Broyles and her staff to find out. The USP monograph for alcohol, for ethyl alcohol, really hasn't changed much in the 25 years I've been using it. And that's not to say that it's not broken, don't fix it. And it's also not to say that it's perfect and we can use it. I think maybe as an industry, we should take a hard look at that monograph. I believe that there are analytical techniques that have improved vastly, and that we, you know, bring some ideas and bring that conversation to USP. They're here for us. They're looking for people in our industry, and I would recommend that that we get involved in USP for those folks that are doing that business.
If I could hug you, I really would. You bring such cogent points, because you're right. You know, when we talk about the public standards for quality, the age is something that factors in. Are the tests antiquated? Are the specifications appropriate? You know, are the specifications so wide you can drive a truck in them? And if the answer is yes, then that does the public health no good. And then you have to balance that with the state of industry and the state of commerce, right? Because USP, we could create a monograph that has some space age technology, but if none of our users on either the manufacturer side or on the drug company side can use it, then the monograph is no good, and we've created a massive compliance issue, which means in the end, our patients don't get safe medicines. This is why working with organizations and companies such as yours, I wholeheartedly say yes. Come to us and, you know, look at the monographs for alcohol, dehydrated alcohol. Isopropanol is another one we're working on because of the adulteration issue. And if you would love to work with us or give us feedback on the monographs, things we can improve, new technologies, we would love to hear it. I can take it back internally to see, can we have just a user forum at USP, you know, with this organization and any others who would like to participate to give us that feedback, because we would love to collaborate with you, because it benefits USP, it benefits your industry, and most of all, the global patient.
Very well said, Christy and Danita. We certainly want to keep this as collaborative as possible, and it has been so far, and we want to keep that momentum going. So appreciate those comments. It's actually a perfect lead-in to our next webinar, which is next week, same time, I believe, Tuesday of next week, same time, which will continue this discussion of USP and potable grade alcohol production only from the laboratory viewpoint and the analytical methods aspect. So perfect lead into that. Danita, if you're available, it would be great to have you on that one as well. There will likely be some dialogue and time for questions next week as well. So
definitely, I may actually bring the scientific liaison along with me at USP who developed and manages the monograph. It would be so beneficial for him to hear that conversation.
very good. Well, there are no more questions that have been submitted, and unless, oh, we did see one just come through now, is that right?
Yep, looks like there's a follow-up here and says, what are some of the GMPs that would be required under USP, which plants currently don't have under FSMA? And is it that GMPs just have to be applied to ethanol since fuel ethanol isn't regulated under FSMA? It's okay if this question waits until next week.
No, I think Andy ought to step in. Andy, unmute yourself.
Yep, unmuted. I'm still here and paying attention. Man, there's so much to say on that particular topic, but that's a very astute question from Stephanie. Certainly, I think you're touching on, you're alluding to one of the hardest topics, which is, how to draw boundaries within your facility. Because going back to my original question, what products do you make? If the answer is multiple products, then different regulations apply, and that's especially hard. And then Christy counseled wisely that when you're considering your management of water as a common resource throughout the facility, because it becomes a part of your finished product, you have to think about it with the same degree of scrutiny as the highest level of regulations that you have happening in your plant. And then we had, I almost entirely avoided talking about ICH with the exception of just a few comments. And I did not talk about the excipient side of the pharmaceutical industry and the gray area represented there. So Stephanie, that's a long-winded intro to say that I think a useful approach for you is to try to draw strict boundaries, both in terms of content and in terms of geography in your plant where you can, about which regulations apply in which area. And to the greatest extent that your resources will allow, apply the highest standard across the board. Now, you have to keep it reasonable. So you're not going to want to follow the drug regs when it comes to your DDGS going out the door. But hopefully that point makes some sense. And I think it could take a little bit more time to contrast the GMPs set by set to illustrate the specific points of difference from the pharma side back down to the food side, back down to the animal food side. But I would gladly do that with you offline, or even create some supplemental materials that could be distributed for this group to answer the same question.
Yeah, I would just offer that I think, back to the element of know your process, know your product, you're going to have to take that 30,000 foot view of your facility, right? And understand all of the recycle streams that happen in an ethanol plant to make it most efficient. And there is a way to ensure that everything inside that boundary is a food grade product. And I would, largely suspect that as you put in FENSA, the Food Safety Modernization Act for feed, that you went through that very same exercise. You just may have to, extend the boundaries and really pay attention where your denaturant for fuel is and where it has been and where it can never be, right? I think that would be one of the greatest hazards that we have in our facilities, is that we've got a petroleum-based product that we're, trained routinely to put in fuel grade alcohol, and that we may have recycled alcohol, or that we may have worked off alcohol that maybe, do you know what I mean, was out of spec, et cetera, and really take a hard look at what you've done in the past, what you can do, and eliminate those hazards, and then go forward with that open mind of everything within these processes needs to be minimum food grade, and in most cases USP, if that's the market you're going after.
Hey,
if you're selling into the vinegar business, you don't have to have a USP product. But if you're going into chemical intermediate business, you don't have to have a USP product. But there's a lot of overlap there. But that's something that you're going to have to, determine.
Hey, Christy, this is Andy. To maybe give Stephanie a little bit more traction for understanding there, I think it's important that we're talking to, a conference of ethanol laboratory managers and people involved in functions around the laboratory operations. The lab is one area where things are done significantly differently in the pharmaceutical world than would be done under either sets of the food GMPs. So not only is it about differences in analytical methodology, it's about differences in philosophy around things like validation. Methods have to be validated. Manufacturing processes have to be validated. It extends extensively into record keeping and documentation. Having a second set of eyes or a peer review on almost everything is required. The way you go about proving that your electronic systems that handle your information, not just process control systems, but where you store your lab information, if some have a LIMS, there are pharmaceutical industry implications for that as well. So those are a few specific examples where you're going to experience substantial differences between what the pharma world requires and what you're doing for other industries.
There's another question that came through here. It says, fail to understand how water quality will affect the distilled alcohol 95% or more unless water is added after distillation to dilute the alcohol. Beers are different. They, FDO, I don't know what that means, get affected by water quality 9, but they are undistilled alcohol. I'm not sure what all that means, but let me put it to you this way. So the water that goes in the front end into fermentation travels with that product, right? And then when you come out of fermentation, you go to the beer well and you start your distillation process. That water is still the same water that was added at the front end. It's just traveling with the product, right? So you're at about, 27% solids, or do you know what I mean? Lower in fermentation. The volume, right, the balance of that product is water, which then goes through the beer still, and you're starting to concentrate up the ethanol through your distillation steps, but the water is still the fermentation water. You're traveling with that same water, and then when you start to pull off that water through your distillation steps, some plants run 30% back. That water goes back to the front end, which tries to get you to, a zero consumption or a 0% water extending out. You've got that same processed water that is always present in the system. So yes, you take it up to about 96%, not that high in the beer well. You're still at about 180 proof, I think, coming off the beer well. You're getting up to 190 proof off the first rectifier, which is 96%. That 4% water is still your front end water that you added in fermentation. So that's processed water that remains with your product throughout the entire stream. The only water that I would say is added, quote, post-process, is if you cut your product from 96% down to 95, which is 1% water, and yeah, you're going to add distilled water, but that other 5% water is processed water that you added at the front end that stays with your product.
Hey, Christy,
so
oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's what you're getting at. I'm not sure I understand, Andy. Do you think that's what I'm getting to?
Well, I think you touched on it. And then I would add that even if you believe you're in a situation where the water has kind of been abandoned after a certain step and you now have your finished ethanol product and it will never see that water again, you have to consider the water quality in its other uses in the facility. So if you're taking in water and you're going to use it for sanitation activities, as an example, especially if you're talking about CIP and contact surfaces, then you have to put special scrutiny on the water quality. So it isn't just in the on-stream scenario, which it's still completely relevant as Christy described, but there are also other off-stream considerations that must be given, and CIP is one of them.
In my opinion, you can't separate processed water from this alcohol. You cannot.
Yeah, I think that's the safest approach. I'd echo that as well. That's the best way to look at it, is to manage all of the water within a certain scope of your operations to the same very high level of expectations, both from a potability standpoint and then also with regard to the trace impurities that are specified in the general chapters of USP if you're engaged in making a USP grade product.
And the follow-up comment is, but that 4% water is distilled water and would not have any element. I disagree with that. You can only say that if you've tested it and proven that. And that goes back to monitoring your processed water and your freshwater input and making sure it's drinking water quality. So you can only say that if you've tested and verified it.
Yeah, if you want to validate that the water that you recover is distilled water and at a certain purity, then that's a project you can take on. It's probably easiest to manage risks at the front end rather than try to prove the mitigation of those risks at the back end.
Agreed. Did I mention that Andy and I tag team the corn plant in Decatur? This was every day, Andy.
We were always fighting an uphill battle against opposing forces in our roles in quality control and quality assurance.
The machine, yeah.
So great
exactly.
discussion, guys. Great discussion. Appreciate all the panelists very much. I would propose we keep the discussion going and pick things up next week. Like I said, we'll have a great follow-up webinar next week focusing on laboratory operations and analytical methods. So hope you can join us next week. Diane, any other points of business before we close out the conference call and just thank all of our great speakers today?
Nope, like I said, echoing thanks to all the panelists today, and a huge thanks to all of our sponsors that are listed here as well, and hope to see you guys back for our subsequent webinars.
Very nice. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Yes, thanks Midland, thanks team. You guys did amazing.
See you everyone. Take care.